Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our weekly podcast, the Rosa and Rubini podcast, making sense of this world. The war in Ukraine is raging. We've entered about the 2 week mark now. And this week, Brunello Rosa has joined me once again to discuss particularly the impact on the economic system and the response from central banks. Bruno, can you give us just a bird's eye view of some of the latest updates on the situation in Ukraine? Do we now have a better sense of what Putin's objectives are for the war?
Yeah, the situation is getting worse by the day. It is clear that this is a full-fledged invasion. The plans reveal that there is a four-pronged attack on Ukraine, going straight target Kiev and probably try to capture the President Zelensky, while clearly the focus really recently has been on the coastal cities of Mariupol on the one end and Odessa on the other end. And perhaps this shows how really Putin wants to make sure that he gets control of the Russian-speaking regions of the country. As we suggested last week, this might be the end game, getting control of the entire country and then annexing the Russian-speaking parts and leaving the other part in the hands of a puppet government. Not sure whether Zelensky can survive politically all this. So these are unfortunately the latest on the ground, and Putin is alternating attacks, days of attacks and days of very unconvincing negotiations.
Right. And I mean, the response in the West has been to wage an economic war. They want to kind of steer clear of setting up a no-fly zone to really reduce the possibility that this escalates into World War III. But has this economic war been effective? What does this involve, Brunello?
Yeah, this is, as we said, an asymmetric war. Russia has invaded a sovereign country with its own tanks, and the West can only respond with economic sanctions. They might be quite draconian, such as banning some banks from SWIFT, reducing or stopping some oil and gas imports from Russia, and imposing all other sorts of prohibitions for Russian companies or individuals, especially the oligarchs around the world, seizing their assets and preventing the central bank from operating in the market, which is the reason why the ruble is tanking. So these sanctions are, of course, hurtful for Russia, who's really close to a potential sovereign default, as it happened last time in 1998, but of course for very different reasons. So somehow the sanctions might be effective.
Right. And, talking about sort of the broader economic impact on the world, you mentioned in your weekly newsletter that the impact of the war will likely be akin to a stagflationary shock. Can you tell me a bit more about what you mean by that?
Sure. So the impact of those sanctions is clearly very detrimental for Russia, but is bad for the countries imposing those sanctions as well. Imagine those companies that are not going to export to Russia their vehicles, for example, as some car making companies have decided to do, or chip making companies have decided to do. So Russia would not receive those goods for sure, but also the company selling those goods is not gonna receive the revenues out of those missed sales. So effectively, everybody suffered from that. So this is like a negative supply shock, not dissimilar from the one of the pandemic that just hit the world and is unfortunately still ongoing. And a negative supply shock is pretty bad for central bankers, because it means that you have growth slowing down and inflation rising. And this is the nightmare scenario for central bankers, because if they increase rates, they may take control of inflation, but worsens the growth scenario. If they lose in monetary policy to soften the economic impact, they will have raising inflation, making the situation even harder to control going forward. So they will really need to think hard how to solve this dilemma.
Right. I want to talk about that dilemma a little bit because, like you said, this is a negative supply side shock, almost like the one we had in COVID. And now the central bankers have to think about, on the one hand, weighing the slower growth that's going to be caused by the sort of supply side shock, but also they're still trying to normalize policy rates after the sort of inflation caused by the mass and record amount of stimulus checks we saw in the aftermath of COVID. So, two kind of alternating priorities here. What I'm curious about is which central banks you think will be kind of particularly sensitive to this calculus. Broadly speaking, do you think this is going to change much in their plan of raising or normalizing policy rates this year?
So central banks will tend to solve this dilemma, the one they have already faced with COVID, as you suggested. So rising inflation and slowing down growth, by trying to see which one of the two objectives, say growth and inflation, will be mostly impacted and first. And I think at this stage, the calculus is going to be the following. Growth has been quite substantive in the post-COVID period because it still enjoys the rebound deriving from the reopening of the economy after the collapse in the pandemic. And so you still see in the developed world quite high growth rates of 4%, 5% of GDP growth. Inflation instead has been rising quite substantially, is now almost 6% in Europe, 7% in the US. And therefore, central bankers probably would think that they can sacrifice a few decimal points of a percentage point of growth without being too optically bad to look at, or even a full percentage point, say from 5 to 4, from 4 to 3, and so on. And you still see kind of decent growth rates, while inflation really needs to be reined in, and therefore you really need to bring it down from 7 or 6% down to 4, 3 as soon as possible. So I think central banks will favor combating inflation over supporting growth, starting from the Fed, which has promised to increase rates in March, and the ECB, who has promised to end its PEP, Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program, in March.
Right. No, it's certainly a very fascinating kind of economic and political time to be living through. And as we're talking about the state response and we're talking about the economic impact on the West and on other countries, I think it's also useful to note the economic impact on Russia. As private companies like MasterCard and Visa cancel the provision of their services, something like the SWIFT sanctions or sanctions on oil, ultimately all of these can trickle down and really hurt the ordinary person there as well. So quite a bit to watch out there as well. But as always, Brunello, thank you very much for your insight. Super useful.
Thank you very much. Next time.